Hi listeners, Jason here. We are excited to finally announce registrations for the biggest psych health and safety community event ever. The inaugural The Psych Health and Safety Conference will be held at the Sofitel Wentworth, Sydney, June 19 to 20, 2024 and offer concurrent virtual attendance. It'll feature live podcast recordings with OG researchers including Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter of Burnout fame, Psych Health and Safety USA podcast host I. David Daniels, Australian super experts including the likes of David Burrows, a special 10-year anniversary integrated approaches to workplace mental health panel with authors Tony LaMontagne, Angela Martin and Kat Page, hand-picked case studies from organisations doing it well, and a very special interview with plaintiff Zagi Kozarov by Catherine Dunlop on that High Court case which we previously covered on the podcast. This event will sell out. Get in quick to secure tickets at early bird prices for the 2-day conference, pre-conference masterclasses, and the VIP dinner. The first 200 in-person registrations also get a copy of her latest book, The Burnout Challenge, signed by Christina Maslach herself. Find out more and register at www.psychhealthandsafetyconference.com. Now, on to this episode.
Based on the severity, duration, and frequency of exposure to psychosocial hazards, workplaces can go from uncomfortable to toxic. The resulting harm can be even more significant for workers who already experience marginalization for other characteristics. We'll talk about toxic workplaces and their impact on the most vulnerable. Up next on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each episode, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk Psych Health and Safety. Welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. So, a toxic workplace is one where workers feel psychologically unsafe, disrespected, threatened. It can include negative behaviors such as bullying, harassment, discrimination, and other unethical behavior. Other signs of a toxic work environment include lack of inclusivity, cutthroat environment, unhealthy competition, aggression, narcissistic behavior, offensive or aggressive leadership, ostracism, and threatening behavior from managers and coworkers. So toxic work environments can also lead to burnout, health issues, decreased productivity, and high turnover rates. Those in toxic work environments may experience anxiety, depression, and stress, and may take more time off, or in some cases, leave the organization either voluntarily or involuntarily. So my guest for this episode not only has experience in what a toxic workplace looks like, but continues to do research on toxic environments, toxic workplaces, and specifically how they affect folks who are already marginalized, who are already having challenges from other segments of their life outside of the workplace that make them a little bit more vulnerable. So to get into the conversation, I'd like to get there the way I generally do, with an introduction of my guest by my guest, in this case with this question. Who is Dr. Heliana Ramirez?
Thank you, Dr. Daniels. It's really nice to be here. I appreciate the invitation and opportunity to chat with you. So I'm a social worker. I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker, but I'm also a researcher of racial and LGBTQ related trauma. In particular, I focus on workplace related trauma that has to do with racial insults as well as anti-LGBTQ biases.
Okay. So we've got lots of conversation to have about those topics. But before I get into a little bit more detail, another rather standard question I ask when folks come on. So, what does psychological health and safety mean to you? When you hear that, what do you think about?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, in part because it is going to be different for different people. For somebody who is living with neurodiversity, for example, who processes information in certain ways, or who communicates in certain ways, or engages other human beings in general conversation in different ways, their experience of psychological safety in the workplace is going to potentially be very different than it might be for somebody who um, for whom English is a second language, or somebody who's living with visible versus invisible disabilities. So when I speak about psychological safety, I can speak for myself as a queer identified light complected Chicana. I have experienced psychological safety when I know that my supervisor and everyone up the chain of command um, are genuinely interested in receiving feedback about ways that the organization can be improved for the purpose of employee wellness, so that they can do a good job for the job that they were hired to do. It sounds kind of simplistic, perhaps, Dr. Daniels, but I think it's actually quite complex. I think that leadership is where psychological safety starts and stops, oftentimes in a workplace. And there are plenty of workplaces out there that have really lovely language and employee handbooks about what to do if somebody experiences um, othering, for whatever it might be like. And for folks who might not be familiar with the term othering, when I use it, I'm referring to the sense that a person is not doesn't fit in, isn't respected. Maybe their voice is ignored in meetings, or they are passed over for promotions. Those kinds of experiences where people's personalities perhaps are being judged rather than the quality of their work. Those experiences send the message that a person is other than that community. So when a person experiences that kind of othering, it's really important that they are able to go to a higher up, be it a direct line manager or human resources, or even the executives of the company, to ensure that they are in an environment where they can do their best job.
Right, right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's yes. Yes, absolutely. The important point you make about being able to go somewhere to get support, to feel as if you're being helped, and a lot of that is about the culture and the organization itself. Does it have those kinds of resources? Do the higher ups know what their role is supposed to be? Have they been trained on how to do that? And I find that there are some that do, but a lot that don't, because that's unfortunately, that's not the way the organization was built in the first place. It was built to make money and or to accomplish whatever its goal is, because there are nonprofits, there are government entities who think it's all about getting the job done, and it doesn't matter how it affects human beings. So they aren't often built to consider the human beings that are in the equation. But you mentioned uh, that you are a social worker, and I've actually talked to folks about this before. But it's an interesting. I don't think there are a lot of folks who connect social work with these conversations about psychological safety and such. So, what stimulated your interest in social work to begin with?
Well, as I was in high school and thinking about graduating and going on to, I knew that I wanted to help people. So I kind of perused psychology, social work, nursing, and at that time, social work was the only profession that I saw a code of ethics that spoke about justice explicitly, that spoke about the responsibility of the professional to identify injustice interpersonally and in institutions and address it. And I should say that social work does not have the best history frankly, in terms of power and privilege and oppression. So it's a complex profession to be in, given that kind of a history. But if I might go back to your initial point about social work and focusing on psychological safety and whether or not they're kind of aligned, when I was teaching undergrads and grad students who were kind of like new to the profession of social work, really talking about the idea of the person in the environment. This is a core concept within social work that also draws from sociology and psychology. But part of what makes social work stand out is that we are systems thinkers. We think about the individual within their family system, within their community system, and so on. So I would actually argue that social work really should be thinking about psychological safety, and that, I bet 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we are going to see more of this kind of conversation in the classroom.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It is very interesting that that sometimes folks forget that. I mean uh, the traditional, social work related issues, housing and employment and, community engagement, development, and all of that, they, at least in my view, as an occupational safety and health professional, are all the foundation is safety itself. A person can't get and keep a job where they don't feel safe. A person can't, find a place to live if they don't feel safe in that community. These words come up all the time. I don't feel safe there. There are people who are unhoused currently. And while society will tell them they need to be in a whatever, they actually feel safer being unhoused. And often it's because of their experiences and what they've, had to deal with over the course of their life. And instead of addressing the safety of the person, we often, and sometimes with, I think, good intention, well, they need this and they need that and they need this and they need that, not having a conversation and trying to figure out what's good for that person. And so I really, I went on to that comment you made earlier about how this is different for everyone. And I know that really, at least I think, that's challenging for for a lot of leaders to go, well, does that mean I have to have a unique approach for everybody? Yeah, it does. It does. The solutions aren't often, sometimes are not really all that complicated, but you can't assume that, you or me or any other person, we can't assume that what works for you will work for me. And that doesn't mean it's bad or good. It just means we're different. It just means we're different. That's important. So,
Absolutely.
so yeah, so talk a little bit about, if you could, I kind of gave some, kind of stuff I found to talk about toxic workplaces and toxic environments. But what's your view of some of the elements and some of the characteristics of toxic workplaces?
Well, they really can vary based on a person's social identities, based on communication experiences. So I mentioned earlier, for people for whom English is a second language, if they have an accent. I was just over the weekend looking at some research on Latino communities and how Latinos for whom English is a second language who have an accent at work, that some of the racialized gaslighting, that is the psychological manipulation that can happen in a toxic environment, um, is associated with a stereotype that having an accent means that somebody is unintelligent and incapable of doing their job. It is not uncommon for Latinos in workplaces to be treated as if they are an alien in their own land, if they were born here. And there are differences also between what Latinas, so women who come from Latin American countries, or their ancestors did, and Latinos, men who come from Latin American countries. The thought is it has to do with a lot of the sexism that's in the workplace as well. So when we add racism plus sexism together, it may not just be an inappropriate touch in the office space between two colleagues, but while that inappropriate touch is happening towards a Latina, she's also being called spicy, or any number of sexualized terms that have to do with racism towards Latinas. So it can be physical touch. It can be messaging that the way that a person speaks or engages is different and therefore not welcome and not valued. But I think that what I've been learning recently about folks who are living with neurodiversity, it also can be about moving quickly and not taking the time to contextualize communication. So, for example, sending a quick message in Microsoft Teams, come and see me, but from a supervisor to a direct report. Somebody who maybe is living with some anxiety or other kinds of issues that have to do with feeling always like they're underperforming or that they're worried that others think that they're underperforming, that simple message with that context can be very frightening versus for somebody else who moves quickly and they tend to just shoot off short messages themselves. So again, I think it really is dependent and context specific, but I can give an example from my own work environment. Um, I was working at Veterans Affairs for many, many years and running LGBTQ programming. So programming for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer identified veterans. And one day I went to my car and my windshield was destroyed. And Dr. Daniels, there was not a big tree limb or anything else around. And at the same time, the posters that I was putting up around campus to outreach for LGBT veterans were being defiled. They were being torn down. People were writing F words and other kinds of derogatory statements towards LGBTQ people on the posters. So was it that somebody was communicating aggression towards me by destroying my windshield? I don't know. But because there was this other homophobic assault on the posters that I was putting up, my automatic thought was, oh, this is an extension of that anti-LGBTQ bias in the workplace.
Right. Wow. And in that situation, in that circumstance, how did the organization respond?
I was so fortunate to be at Veterans Affairs at that period of time. It was prior to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So officially in the military, there was a policy that many have critiqued as actually being creating a further unsafe environment for LGBTQ service members at work, even though it was written to be a middle ground. Saying, well, as long as people don't talk about who they are at work in terms of their sexual orientation or gender identity, well, really their sexual orientation, then nobody will ask. But that's not how it worked out. So the fact that this VA allowed me to create an LGBT veteran support group while that policy was still in place, I think speaks very highly of the real commitment to quality medical care, because that's what the issue is. When patients are able to fully disclose to their providers who they are, it leads to better health outcomes and it leads to better health care in the interim. So I would say that in general, I was extremely lucky. This was one of the first 15 VAs across the nation that actually had LGBTQ programming. That particular incident, we don't know what happened. So there was no real follow-up option other than, people recognized that it was very distressing, but there wasn't really any other action that could be taken.
Sure. Yeah, it is. Those are examples. Again, you've given a nice kind of description of almost the extremes of the touching that may not be inappropriate to me, that's inappropriate to the other person, all the way over to the vandalism of my personal, vehicle. And these things are unfortunately happening in workplaces all the time. And part of the challenge is, and that's why I was curious how or if the organization responded, because I honestly, so my opinion is that this is not about, we don't really address this by simply looking at individuals. We have to look at the culture of the organization itself that allows that kind of behavior, that sometimes encourages it or takes no action. It says it's inappropriate, but takes no action once it does happen. Because I as I have more birthdays, I'm less interested in binary choices, and I'm also not really into absolutes because people will say, "Oh, that's a horrible thing." Well, if you're in a group and the group does MMA fighting, yes, they do punch each other, but that's what the culture is, and people get into the ring knowing that the other person is going to punch them, so that it's not a surprise. But the challenge is many organizations aren't clear about what the culture really is. And even what they describe, they'll say that it's inappropriate, but there's really no system to monitor that. There's no response when it does happen. Therefore, their words don't mean anything. So if you say, yeah, we're here to protect our gay brothers and sisters, and then one is, mistreated, attacked, whatever the case might be, and you don't respond, it would be better if you just didn't say that. And then I can just kind of take care of myself and not expect the organization to do anything about it. So that's kind of why I asked that question. And often I still want to believe it is not that everyone in an organization is racist, homophobic, ableist. It's not, but the systems that are in place have gaps because those systems were not set up by gay people. They're most often set up by cisgender white men who, for all their, areas where they may be good, what they can't do is be something that they're not. So they set these systems up and then expect everybody to conform to them rather than having the system conform to make a safe space for the people that, we all say that we want to have. Yeah, you've talked about that, personal experience. Have you had other experiences, is that the one?
No, I've definitely had others. It's across the lifespan.
Oh, sure.
And I think, the interesting part for me of what you were just saying of like who created the systems and how much do we know about the history of organizations and the thought process that went into them. I think what's so powerful about any group that is made invisible and also highly visible at the same time, and LGBTQ people are like this, because we don't teach the LGBTQ history oftentimes, we don't know that the US military was actually founded by Baron von Steuben, who was himself a gay Prussian who was brought in to write the first drilling manual that is still used today. And so, right, in the US military. And it's, and I was thinking about when you were saying earlier as well about, supervisors and managers who might feel somewhat flummoxed by, oh, does this mean I need to, address all of these different unique experiences? I think part of what happens when we're raised in societies that have very strict messaging about what men are supposed to do and what men are not supposed to do, and expectations that about whiteness and power, there's a false sense that one needs to be perfect and that perfection is actually even possible. And so I think many supervisors and managers are actually set up for some really complex situations, irrespective of whether or not they actually receive training to be managers and directors and so on. Just from the get-go, being trained early on that if we just stop and ask people, what is your experience? What would you like right now? How could I help? Oftentimes they are very simple responses that are actually within our control, because I think most people who go to work are going to work because they need a paycheck.
Yes.
And
Yes.
they care about the quality of their work. And so they are very much interested in finding solutions that are doable.
Right. Yeah. And again, to reinforce that point. And then there is this command and control kind of leadership model that's made to be the paragon of all leadership. So in order to be a leader, you have to be a George Patton, strong, yell at people, point, whatever it is. And that's not the only way to lead. It just isn't. And so we tend to lack these inclusive kinds of leadership models that say, first of all, We need to agree where we are going, not I need to decide where you are going. I think that's a lot of the challenge, particularly for more quote unquote traditional leaders, is that they don't respond well when someone has a different idea than them, even though that other idea is it may help us reach our goal quicker. It may be more innovative, more creative, but because when I went to business school, I was told to be a strong leader means I know everything, you know nothing. And a lot of that is based that, it's that old industrial revolution thinking back in the day when the supervisor probably did know everything because they're the only person who can read or write. We're not there anymore. We're just not. We people are our education system with all its foibles is certainly more effective than it was in the 1800s. It's certainly better now than it was in the 50s. And it is, even if it weren't better, human beings now have access to more information and data and can make more decisions than they ever could before. So they don't really need someone micromanaging every detail, telling them how to what the color their hair should be, whether they should wear glasses or not, and what time. In some cases, even if they should show up in person. And I think folks are struggling with that. I think they are. And it's an opportunity for us as a society to recognize that, and again, so how can we recraft these organizations to be able to be, more accepting of differences and accepting of all the people that we say we want to bring their skills. So you mentioned the fact that that you do a lot of work in BIPOC and LGBTQ plus types of environments. Do you think that these toxic work environments have a more or less significant impact on these communities?
That's a great question. So research on weathering the impact of daily racial stress and other kinds of discrimination is showing us that it is extremely dangerous for our health to be in environments where we are constantly having to second guess ambiguous comments, wondering whether or not that actually was a racial slur, or, did that person really just mean to say what I think they said? It is exhausting. And we see now that there is increased and earlier onset stress-related illnesses like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, obesity for people of color who are in predominantly white institutions. And we see that there's one study actually that was looking at Black graduates of historically Black colleges and universities have 35% less metabolic syndrome than do Black graduates of predominantly white institutions. And the thought is, again, it is just so exhausting to be in environments that people are constantly having to manage things like stereotype threat. So the idea that I need to be very careful what I say, what I do. Black women especially have the experience of being labeled as angry Black women in the workplace, even if she's sitting there smiling, even if she has very carefully controlled lilt to her tone of voice and all of the things. The way that racism shows up in the United States is an automatic reaction to especially Black women and Black men in workplaces. And there's a definite impact on our health when we're having to be in those kinds of situations. So another study that came out of Detroit, Mexican ancestry people who had higher education and higher income had earlier onset disability and death than did Mexican ancestry people with less education and income. For the Black people in this study, the level of education and income made no difference. For white people, the higher the income, the higher the education, the longer their lives and the fewer years of disability. And they were measuring this based off of biological markers like telomere length. So these have to do on the genetics of how able the body is to fend itself off from toxins in the environment or other kinds of things that could lead to illness. So and what they think is happening there with Mexican ancestry people in this particular study is that the higher the education and the higher the socioeconomic status, the more likely it is that people would not be living in an ethnic enclave. And so therefore they would have more frequent exposures, especially to white communities.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish DX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow Flourish DX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the Flourish DX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
Do you think this is something that organizations who say they are interested in diversity, in equity, in safety, in equal opportunity, do you think this is something that they should pay a little bit more attention to before they hire people or after they hire people?
I'm going to say any company that's interested in making the maximum amount of money that they possibly can, which is every company, should be thinking about these things before hiring. I would say, forget about whether or not a company is interested in diversity, equity, inclusion. If they are trying to make the most money, they would be creating an environment where they can hire as diverse a pool of talent as possible and not lose the massive amount of money that's spent recruiting and hiring and onboarding people.
Right. Yeah, I rather suspected that'd be the answer to the question because it seems so obvious to some of us that why would you create a system that is either intentionally or unintentionally limiting the pool of talent that you can recruit? It just doesn't make sense. It costs an awful lot of money to go through the recruiting process. And then to have a position vacant for days or weeks or months at a time because you can't find the quote unquote the right person, the right fit. And often the fit is they don't look the same. They don't talk the same. It's not that they can't do the work. They just present differently. I mean, these organizations, for example, who have standards that say, well, we gladly hire them, but they have a tattoo, or they have a body piercing, or their hair is a different color. It's like, I honestly, I don't really understand it. And I don't understand sometimes how some of these organizations and cultures are so dedicated to it that they'll go out of business ultimately because they're so dedicated to remaining the same way. And I just don't understand it. So you talked about some of these physical impacts, and I think that's a really important discussion because when I talk about psychosocial hazards or a psychosocial factor that's perceived or experienced by the person as a threat that ultimately affects their behavior, I sometimes, even from more traditional safety professionals, HR folks, leadership folks, I get I can't see that. And what you described is that there is a physical manifestation that's ultimately, you're going to see that, and you're going to see higher use of sick leave and greater absenteeism and, safety kinds of, incidents, chest pain, transport to the hospital, high blood pressure, all these kinds of health-related things. But in many cases, it starts, or at least in the workplace it does, with exposure to this kind of unsafe environment. So just talk a little bit more about, the importance of making the connection between the two as opposed to assuming it's one or the other.
Yeah, I think it's a really important and exciting time to be having these kinds of conversations because of advances in magnetic resonance imaging, MRIs, and fMRIs, which are the functional MRIs. So these are brain scans. And we now see that people who experience bullying, whether it's in a classroom as a grade school student or an adult in a workplace, that you can see the changes to brain structure. So we're seeing changes to the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain that controls one's ability to problem solve, to think about the future and the past. And we see also changes in the amygdala, which is essentially the brain's alarm system that's telling us whether or not there's safety or risk in the environment. And I think this is so important because historically, when somebody was treated so badly at work that they end up with challenges like anxiety or depression or post traumatic stress disorder, if they were to end up in a court, um, the jury might say, well, yeah, I hear what you're saying, that you're crying a lot and you're having these intrusive thoughts and all this kind of stuff, but I can't really see it. Well, now we can see it in these fMRIs and MRIs. So it really is kind of an interesting time where we're going to start to have maybe an ability to see damage that wasn't visible before, but it's not just there. It's also that there's a neuroplasticity that can happen where we can help to um, heal our brains, different parts of brains after they've been injured. So I think it's an important topic also because employers who hire employees are not necessarily going to know what kind of an environment that employee worked at previously. And so many people who have experienced workplace abuse end up traumatized and they go to the next job immediately without an opportunity to really work through that trauma. And so they can have reactions in that new workplace that can be very complex. And so I think there's, that's the flip side of this is like, how do employers create environments that are not only intolerant of abuse in its various manifestations, but also is creating an environment where people really can have the most productive thought and the most creative, problem solving and so on. And in 2024, my goodness, we are at no loss of existential crises. They're
Right.
everywhere these days, workplace psychological safety aside, there are many reasons I think why it is to the benefit of the bottom line of the company to start having these conversations.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I can't think of any situation where any business, any organization is bringing in a new human being that has not had some form of trauma at some point in their life. It's hard to conceive of a situation like that. I mean, whether it happened to you directly or indirectly. I mean, I think about folks that are my youngest son's age, born in 1990, and they're 11 years old, and the world, 9/11 occurs. They're, graduating high school, and we have an economic downturn. They're 5 years old, and they hear about the people who got shot at Columbine. There's all of these things, and there's a lot of conversation about how these younger generations seem to have more stress and anxiety and all. Well, yeah, because it's not as if I'm not suggesting at all. I don't necessarily believe that the world is more violent than it used to be. I don't think it is, to be quite honest. I mean, there was times when when folks would just go out and shoot each other, and have a duel and shoot each other in the middle of the street. So that's not going on. But the difference is because of our communication systems, people hear about it. It is broadcast in seconds and people just know about it. And we get so much of it all the time. And of course, in media, if it bleeds, it leads. So you have all these circumstances. So I say all that to say that anyone who walks into the workplace is probably coming with something. And the question is, what are you going to do as an organization to A, recognize that, and B, not make it worse, and C, be able to respond when the person is having some sort of reaction to whatever it is. And it doesn't make you bad people. It doesn't say it was your intent. It may have nothing to do with you. A person just feels the way that they feel. And instead of, as much as I would love for you to, hire, Dr. Ramirez or myself to come do this big study, there's data available from the person when they say, that doesn't feel right to me. That's data right there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I also happen to know that you that you've done and continue to do work around even more severe examples of this, particularly in helping organizations uh, create environments where people don't, aren't they don't contribute to the thoughts of suicide and other self-harming types of behavior. So, can you talk a little bit about, your background and expertise in that area? Because I've heard you speak a number of times before, and you seem to have a depth of understanding that whole issue, particularly as it spills over, into the workplace, and how people can kind of be aware and create safer environments from that really significant kind of event.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a topic that really, really matters to me. As a social worker, I've been engaged in suicide prevention for 20 some odd years now. And working with veterans, of course, this was a really, really important issue. But it turns out that suicide is a very common experience, and we're seeing it increasing as well. Um, Following the recent passing of Dr. Antoinette Candia Bailey, who was the Student Affairs Vice President at Lincoln University, she was bullied and then mobbed. So she was bullied by her supervisor. She went to the executive board of the university asking for assistance. They said they don't involve themselves in personnel matters. She was then fired. So that's when the bullying becomes the mobbing, because they're weaponizing the organizational power to push her out. And then a few days later, she died by bullycide. So that is when workplace bullying or bullying at school causes such severe pain that the person's only thought of how they can get away from the pain is through suicide. Um, Suicide for Black women ages 18 to 65 in the United States, there are higher rates of suicide among this particular group of women than all other groups of women in the United States. But we're not talking about that very often in public, I think because of misogynoir, the intersection of racism and sexism against Black women. And if this was happening to white women, I think that it would be on the news. I think we would be hearing this kind of thing, like we hear about white men who are in their later years having higher rates of suicide. We know that, many of us. So it's an issue that I think is really important, because we do know that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and LGBTQIA people end up experiencing higher rates of workplace abuse and discrimination. And so there is a real storm that can be created, especially when articulate, intelligent people with subject matter expertise who also have a real strong sense of justice and an internal sense of needing to identify when injustice is happening in the workplace, which is the perfect combination of identities that tend to really cause distress to imposter leaders who then turn around and start bullying. What happens, and then if they're mobbed and forced out of the organization, it can be such a profound distress. Distress isn't the right word, but this is, when we're talking about Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, LGBTQIA people, we're talking about people who have really had to climb through hoops to get to that point in their lives in the first place. Getting through higher education in environments that typically are not set up for people of color or LGBTQ people means that one, in order to get through, is having to, walk through those minefields, frankly, of interpersonal biases. And so by the time that they make it into their career, if they end up being targeted by an imposter leader and pushed out, it can be complete devastation. And that's why we do see suicide. In fact, Whistleblowers of America did a study. 50% of the people who completed their survey had some level of suicidal ideation. 50%. That is huge, Dr. Daniels. That is. So there is, this is an issue that I feel very, very strongly about, in part because suicide prevention in general in the United States is not talking about people's experiences in the workplace. And I really believe that part of what needs to happen for suicide prevention for workplace abuse survivors is to be talking about how people can get out of these abusive workplace situations. Because just like domestic violence or any other kind of interpersonal abuse, there are many factors, including economic, that keep people in very dangerous situations. I'm creating a suicide prevention intervention specifically for workplace abuse survivors.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Yeah. And I realize that for there seems to be almost a fear or a thought out there that if you talk about it, it makes it worse. And I just don't believe it. I think if you don't talk about it, it makes it worse. I think that, and again, I say these things about, I try to be kind of, well, no, I try to be non-judgmental of these situations, because if I thought that everyone out there was simply out to get me or out to get other people, I wouldn't get out of bed. So I just don't believe that everyone is out to get everyone. I don't think the world is full of a bunch of evil people. But what I do believe is that situations and circumstances that are set up to be safe and beneficial and comfortable for one person may not be that way for somebody else. And there just isn't enough acknowledgement of that. So again, that program may work great for you and your friends and whoever you started the group. I say often that I do everything perfect for me. The things I do for me are always perfect. And that's where it stops. That's where it stops. I do it because I thought it was a perfect thing to do for me. The challenge is when I'm interacting with other people, what's going to be perfect for me may not be perfect for the other person. And then it becomes a question is, let's not even try to get perfect. What works for us? I think those are the conversations that don't happen. What's going to work for us? I also said this one here recently, and I continue to repeat it. I don't believe you should be working for anyone. I think we should be working with people. I have a role, you have a role, but I don't work for you. You don't own me. Last I heard, there was this thing called an Emancipation Proclamation a few years ago, that you don't get to own people just because they happen to be in the same organization as you, and you happen to be in a position of leadership, and you both have a role to play. And so what's good for us? I mean, I want you to make money so I can get my portion of it. But it doesn't work really well when we simply impose, I think this works for me and you will do it this way. And I think what some employers are starting to find out is that folks aren't going to do it anymore. They'll opt out and go do something else. They have many more options than they used to. There are folks who are opting for tiny homes and van life, just not have to put up with the stress of the traditional kind of organization. And but I also think, back to the point we were just making, that it's important to have folks such as yourself to help us deal with some of these. They seem heavy, but they're going to get heavier if we don't talk about them. Because I can tell you, having been in an organization who lost a coworker that died by suicide, it sometimes is so traumatic to the people who just know about it that it's difficult for them to continue and do good work themselves. And sometimes the reputational damage associated with that. So I'll call them out, Lincoln University, I think, is going to have some challenges in dealing with this circumstance. Regardless, again, I don't know anyone there. I don't know what their interest in resolving this is. But this is all kind of public information, but it's going to be really difficult. They're going to have to work really hard to outlive, just the reputational damage associated with Dr. Candia Bailey's loss and the trauma it's created for a lot of people who never even met her. It's a thing, and we just really need to be thinking about this before it happens, not after. Not after.
I absolutely agree with you. And I would like to just acknowledge that there are some really, really brilliant Black women who are at the forefront of helping other Black women get out of toxic jobs. And Dr. Carrie Azid, if anyone is looking for this kind of a book, has written a phenomenal workbook. It's called Unbreak My Soul: How Black Women Can Begin to Heal Workplace Trauma. And I had the great honor of working with her in a LinkedIn Live event where she talked about her experience of workplace abuse and her work helping other Black women to get free from workplace abuse, but importantly, how to heal that workplace trauma as well. Um, and I think that the other piece of this is that there's no final feeling besides the final feeling. And people's brains who are traumatized, it can happen to anybody. It can happen to any of us. In the right circumstance, these thoughts can come up. And so, how we deal with it at work, exactly to your point, other people who are coworkers who lose a colleague who died by suicide, they're going to be impacted. There's no way around it otherwise. And talking about suicide prevention does not create the idea for people. People have that idea already.
Right.
um,
Right.
but the other piece that you mentioned is, I think I agree with you. I don't think that the majority of people on the planet are evil. I don't even know how many people would actually be evil. I just know there are a lot of people walking around with trauma. And when a lot of people are walking around with trauma, we make very quick decisions that are not based in thought, and they're not based in, bottom line for the company's benefit. They're not based on wellness of employees. They're based on a sense of a knee-jerk reaction to feeling unsafe. And so many supervisors who maybe were promoted too soon and they didn't actually have the skill set themselves or what have you, can have a shining star employee and be so threatened by that person. They're not even really thinking through all of the different pieces that we've just been talking about. They're just reacting from a place of trauma. So I think it would really behoove us to have more conversations about stigma and psychological safety for that reason.
Right. Absolutely. So, just before we conclude, if there are folks out there who have listened to some of the things you've had to say over the last little less than an hour, and it's resonating with them. They may not have, because I have to tell you, there's some things that you shared. I hadn't heard that before. I have to be honest. I can like, wow, just really didn't think about that. And again, I'm just so honored that you take some time to hang out with me here. And they want to learn more. They want to learn more. So how would they do that? How would folks learn a little bit more about the work that you do, and perhaps maybe they have need of some of the conversations that you'd be able to have with them? How would they do that?
The best place to connect with me is on LinkedIn. I'm doing most of my outreach on LinkedIn at this point because I think it's a very common place for people to go who are leaving or having just left abusive workplaces. So it's a really lovely environment to start up events like this. Last weekend, I did a Latina toxic job grief altar building event. It was not therapy. It was a cultural experience where we applied the cultural practice of altar building in an online environment. So we're using the strength and the resiliencies of our ancestry to respond to and to heal from the grief and the loss that is part of this. So, if people are interested in those kinds of experiences, or like I just did the Black Women Toxic Job Survivor LinkedIn Suicide Prevention Series. Those recordings are online and people can access them at no cost. And I am just about to launch my website for Hostile Workplace Recovery LLC, a company that I have just founded that is specifically to support self-defense and recovery of Black, Indigenous people of color, and other LGBTQIA employees.
Wow, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and again, thank you for the work that you're doing, and uh, the passion that you have, not only for folks that, because I thought this was it was really moving for me to see someone uh, really stand up for someone who is similar but different from them, because I think it's easy to to go out and stand up for folks that are exactly like me. It is really important that we stand up for each other, because often I really believe that big movements and even sometimes small movements really happen because we work together. And I need someone who's not in the same situation that I'm in, someone to care about the situation that I may be in at the time. But it's wonderful to see. And again, thank you for the work that you're doing. And you have a fan here. I have to tell you, I'll share this. And I heard about the series that you were doing and had opportunity to listen in. And in many cases, I think I may have been one of the few men to participate, but the information in and of itself is valuable to anyone, particularly another human being. I just have to be another human. And I just heard so many things. But on top of that, it's very helpful for those of us who have moms and wives or spouses or significant others or sisters or nieces, or, it was just very helpful. So again, thank you so much for the work that you have done and will be doing, and for joining me here for this conversation. I really appreciate it. And for those of you who are watching this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast on the Flourish DX YouTube page, please do like us, subscribe, share, pass along this information to others. If you're watching or listening to the podcast for the first time, welcome. I hope that something you've heard will bring you back in the future. Previous episodes of the podcast can be found at psychhealthandsafetyusa.com. Please do become a part of the movement that we're attempting to create around psychological health and safety by contacting us on LinkedIn as well. And we'll certainly hope to hear from you and be able to share another episode of the podcast soon. So thanks very much, and we'll look forward to the next episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Thanks very much. Tune in each Friday for new episodes of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. If you have a story or know of one that needs to be told, reach out to us on LinkedIn or send an email to david@id2-solutions.com, or go to the Flourish DX website at flourishdx.com. We'll see you next time.